Okay, good afternoon and welcome to FIT Talks, the college's oral history project. I'm Alex Joseph, the managing editor of Ingenue Magazine. Today is April 24th, 2019. We are speaking to Linda Tain, a longtime faculty member in FIT's fashion design department and also held a position in FIT's union for many years. So, hi Linda.
Hi Alex.
So just to get us started for a little bit of context, can you tell me about your childhood a little bit?
My childhood.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, as I'm a twin, an identical twin, and I grew up in Miami till I was about 5, then came to New York, and always wanted to be in fashion. I drew from a very early age, and I had a wonderful high school teacher who lives a few blocks from here, Millie Glaberman, who recommended that I go to FIT. And that's how I came to FIT.
Did your twin sister also become creative? Did she do creative work? Or?
No, she went to Brooklyn College. She got married at 19. Her husband was a physician, went to medical school, and she traveled with him all over the country. But she's very artistic. She's very good at interior design and has done a lot of work personally for her place and my place and friends. And she's good at that. So there is that ability, you know.
Were any family members in the fashion industry, or did you have any exposure to it?
No, but they were artists and they were musicians. And I had an aunt who and an uncle, both Russian-born, that were painters. And they kind of encouraged my talent all along. And my family really accepted it. I mean, in a time when people generally wanted you to go and be a school teacher, teach at elementary school and that sort of thing. But they let me fly, you know. So.
Do you remember what you wanted to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a fashion designer.
All right.
And I would always look at my mother's clothes, my aunt's clothes. We grew up in kind of like a family, connective family. My aunt lived with us, my grandpa lived with us, my mother. And my mother was an excellent seamstress. My grandmother had golden hands. There was nothing she couldn't do, including cooking. But she sewed, she crocheted, she knitted, she did wonderful crafts. And through them, I kind of like got into it and started to make things. And I remember as a child, they used to wrap, when you'd send clothes or shirts to a laundry, they'd wrap them in brown paper, you know, big sheets of brown paper. So I used to take this brown paper I remember that when I was 4 or 5, and I'd tape it to the wall, and I would draw ladies in clothes, like my height, wearing all these clothes for all these occasions. And that was my way of playing. And it was a little strange. And probably because today I like to draw large, actually. And that still is with me. So I think that may have come from that experience.
You drew large, what do you mean?
Big size. Wow. Like here, these Esther Larson drawings are fairly large drawings, but my drawings were probably twice the size of those drawings.
Wow. At the time, the Americans didn't have big name designers, did they? Or do you remember were there some specifically you were thinking about?
There were big name designers, and there were illustrators that were quite famous. Joe Halpern was very famous. Lord & Taylor had Dorothy Hood, and several other several other people. They had a wonderful menswear illustrator. Esther Larson, of course, worked for Bergdorf's. J. Hyde Crawford for Bonwitella when Bonwitella was a store. There was someone wonderful that worked, well, there were a lot of people that worked for Macy's. And the reason I know that is because that was really my first full-time job. I was hired as an illustrator to do newspaper ads and catalogs for Macy's. Before that, I was doing drawings for Glamour and Mademoiselle and Ingenue and magazines like that, because fashion was changing from a 50s style to a 60s style. And the 60s style was all about youth and a new look. But piggybacking on the your question about designers, in the 50s, there were, of course, the wonderful European designers, Balenciaga, people like that, Givenchy and all that. But here in New York, or in this country, you had Norman Norell, you had James Galanos, you had Pauline Trégère, Bill Blass. I mean, there was a whole group of designers, that Jeffrey Bean, I mean, who were really doing wonderful things, and they were top at what they did. But of course, clothes hadn't filtered down to a mass market level yet. They were just thinking about going into diffusion lines, where the price point was a little less and the look was a little younger. So maybe their regular line was for the mother, but the diffusion line was for the daughter.
Now you're talking about your work, so after you left FIT.
Right.
Can we back up for just a second? Tell me about how you said a high school teacher who still lives nearby recommended you to the college. Do you remember your first impressions of it, or?
Of FIT?
Yeah.
I will never forget it.
Oh, okay. Let's do that.
Well, when she recommended me to FIT, and she taught, actually it was very interesting because most high schools did not have fashion classes per se. She had a fashion class, and you could take it over and over again if you wanted to. Fern Malice was a student of hers. Wow. Also, a few of the politicians that you would know were students of hers as well. I'll come back to that. I'll let you know when I can think of who it was. But anyway, she had some very famous students at James Madison High School. This was in Brooklyn. So when she made the connection with FIT, I applied to FIT. I didn't apply to any other schools. That's how dumb I was. You know, I really didn't know that you apply to other schools, and it was really strange. So I come to FIT. It's the first time I ever was in the city by myself, and I come here, and the minute I walked in the building, I loved it. I said, I want to be here. I just love it. Somehow I found where they were doing the interviewing. And, you know, when we used to do fashion design interviewing or for illustration, it was done in a big room, and people sat there and they did a sketch, and then they were called up to a desk to see someone, to interview someone. So I was interviewed by Frank Shapiro, who was at one time chair of the Fine Arts Department, with a cigarette dangling out of his mouth, because then you could smoke in the classroom, you could smoke all over the college, whatever.
The good old days.
And he's looking at my portfolio, which I had prepared meticulously, and he's turning the pages, and I'm standing there, not saying a word, like like I'm mute or something, and he's turning the pages and he says, "So you like to draw, huh?" So I go like this, and then he says, "So could you start in the fall?" And I go like this. He closes the book, he hands it back to me, and that was that. But the thing is, I knew I wanted to be there immediately because everything about that school had the right vibe. So,
did you have other experiences? Like, do you remember anything specific that gave you that vibe? Was there just...
I think it was in the air, really, because I had gone to Parsons, and not that I interviewed them, they interviewed me to teach there, but there was a different vibe in Parsons than in FIT. FIT was more embracing, more inclusive. Parsons was a little bit like an elite school, and they had been around for many more years than FIT. So I just felt like I was coming home, and I had met people in my classes. People liked to do the same things I did. They had, a lot of ability. There was a lot of talent, and I thought it was the greatest place going.
You were here with all the kind of legendary people who came here. Do you remember any of them when they were students?
Well, Antonio Lopez.
Yes, let's talk about him.
Well, he was actually, let me say this to you. Stephen Stippleman and myself, Stephen was in the class before me. Antonio Lopez was in the class before him, because I'm younger than both of them.
Stephen Stippleman is also
an alum.
An alum in a fashion illustration faculty?
No, he's fashion design.
Okay, sorry.
Fashion design. And Stephen's now here about 25 years, which is, but he taught in Parsons for 25 years also, before he came here. Anyway, so start count on your fingers. But Tony used to, even though he had, I don't think he ever graduated, but he used to come in, sit in on our sketch classes. After we graduated, we used to take sketch classes with Francis Needy. And Stephen and I used to take them, and Tony used to come with models, 2 or 3 models, with clothes from Saks Fifth Avenue, because he was working for Saks at the time, and they changed into these fabulous clothes, and then we would sketch them. And then he would walk around, we would all work. In 5 minutes, he had the most beautiful sketch. I think my phone is on.
Oh.
Okay. And he would do a sketch in 3 seconds. I mean, he was fabulous, but he was very generous, very, very kind, very sweet, not full of himself, very, very kind of down to earth. And he appreciated what other people did. He once told me something so wonderful. I can't even share it because it's so personal. But I was so, it actually helped me move forward, because it put me in touch with my talent and the possibilities of what I was able to accomplish. And it was just a few words, so it was really wonderful. Stephen and I kept talking a mile a minute all the time. And even today, as you know, we're very good friends. He's my oldest friend. Stephen and I know each other probably 55 years. And who else was here? Norma Kamali was around, but we weren't that friendly with her because she was in design.
Right. Or like Calvin Klein was earlier.
Like Calvin Klein was much earlier. Okay. Yeah. And I'm trying to think who else was around who, you know, it's funny, like we were in class, and very few of those people that we shared a class with came back and taught at FIT. But I don't know of that many people that really graduated and really infiltrated the business, really went into the business at that time. Except for people like Norma and trying to think who else. Well, Stephen, you know, worked for Bendel's, and then Women's Wear directly right after that. But you know, at that time, the departments were just growing. I mean, the classes were just beginning. You know, it was just maybe 3 years past where I was, and then, you know, it started to bloom. And there was one section. There wasn't more than one section.
Was there, obviously it was before computers became part of the classroom experience, but other things you remember about the education itself? Faculty who made an impression?
I don't know whether I should say. Well, I have to say this to you. We teach very differently than the methods that, or the lack of, that we had when we went to FIT. At one time, they hired people, this is before there was, you know, rules and regulations about that if they had some kind of relation, somehow some inkling about fashion, they hired them. They weren't hired necessarily because they worked as professionals. Some did, but there was no really teaching methodology. We would go into a sketch class and we would draw from a model 6 hours a day. And then we would do all the other work. And at that time, the major was fashion illustration and advertising design. So we had a double major. So we had to learn the advertising layouts, we had to learn techniques, typography, the materials that are used in that major as well as in our major. There were some very good people in advertising design. Ruth McMurray was one. She was crackerjack. She probably was the, like they talk about Mad Men, she was Mad Woman. And Bill Ronan was also fabulous. And his sister was a big, Mary Ronan was a big advertising person. In the illustration area, it was kind of, I don't know. It wasn't like those people had really careers, strong careers. We were given like lots of artwork by Kenneth Paul Block and by Crawford and by Fred Greenhill, and I mean the level was good, you know, what to aspire to, but they didn't show us how to do it. We learned from each other, and we learned from doing it, and that we really learned about it once we went out to work. When I worked. Well, in the magazines, they didn't teach you anything. They just bought what you did. You know, they liked my work because it was young and kind of, you know, different from that sophisticated Greenhill kind of Dorothy Hood mode. They didn't want that. They wanted young. They wanted young.
What was your first job? Do you remember?
My first job was a spread in Ingenue Magazine. I still have it. And I mean, when I look at those drawings, they're like so, it's like I was challenged or something. Something was, I don't know what. They were like, oh, I don't know. I'm kind of embarrassed. I've shown them to students. I said, I want to show you something. This is where I began. And I draw every Friday night. Stephen, myself, and a couple of other professionals, we hire a model, we sketch. I said, this is where I started. This is what I'm doing now. Look at the difference. Can you see the and they can see it, but they still don't think this is bad, you know. What I did earlier was, I look at it and I say, I don't even know how I sold that, how these people bought it. But once they saw that, it was like 17 magazine. They like ran in, they have to have it and whatever. And then Glamour, I went there probably 40 times until they hired me, paid me $10 a sketch. And I was thrilled to get it because I wanted to have work in the magazine. And I did. And those were my first jobs up to about 8-9 months when I interviewed for Macy's, and they hired me as a junior illustrator because I was the youngest one. I think I was 21 when they hired me, and everybody else was probably over 30. I thought that they had one foot in the grave, another one on a banana peel. And I just couldn't, you know, and I learned from them because they would say to me, come over here, I want to show you something. And they would be either working on intimate apparel. They'd show me how they did lace. Or this guy would show me how he was doing tulle. Or this one was doing this, or this one. Because there were 10, 12 artists in fashion alone, just working on the premises, never mind the freelance people that came in. Dora did very famous, did work for Macy's. Antonio did work for Macy's. I mean, people, they had great artists working for Macy's at that time because a lot of the work was all newspaper ads. It didn't go to photography till much later on. And then
you mean they would stop using drawings to advertise the product?
They decided that it was more believable to the customer to show a photograph of a garment rather than do an illustration, even though an illustration is more fantasy-based. And people can imagine it more rather than showing them the garment. So and also because of, I guess there was ways of digitizing the photographs a little bit. It was starting to happen at that time. They were fascinated with the technology. And they thought, ooh, this is so new. It's like when Photoshop first came in. People were going, we only want the Photoshop. We only want the Photoshop people that do their artwork on Photoshop. Now, Photoshop is like what? It's here. I mean, it's not new. Now they want freehand. I went to, occasionally I still do freelance work. I have a friend, Tony Nuzzo, who works for Hanes Brands, which is, they probably have 14 brands of intimate apparel. And I got into that area because of him. Because I met him at FIT, and he was in the department, and then he decided he wanted to leave FIT, and he went out into the big world and did major work for a lot of the Limited, the Gap, Carolyn Rom, so many people. He lived in Israel for 2 years, just overseeing the Gap production there. But he connected with Hanes Brands that does Bally, Maidenform, Wonder Bra, all those brands. That's kind of like popular price point brands. And he knew I drew, and I drew intimate apparel, and he gave me a lot of work. And I worked for them all, you know. Actually, one of my first jobs, you asked me what my first job
Yes.
was. Once I was working for Macy, once I was working for Macy's, I interviewed right across the street from Lord & Taylor. There was a company called Van Ralt. They were a big intimate apparel company, big as maiden form. And I go up there, and I'm there, and who is the artist that is working for them? Esther Larson. And she's doing their catalog, 350 sketches. You should pardon the expression. And I go into the interview office, and who's sitting there but one of the girls I went to school with, who I was very friendly with. And oh my God, you're here, and how this is so great, and everything like that. I show her my portfolio. What did they want now? They were doing, this is when it first started to come out, a junior line of intimate apparel, because they knew the daughters didn't want to buy all these girdles and all-in-one bras and the long lines and all that. So they said, we're looking for a young artist who's going to do the junior line for us. They called it junior at that time. So she looks at my portfolio. She says, perfect, you're hired. She says, we have 350 sketches for you to do. And it's going to, I said, how much time? In a week? She said, no. She says, you probably will have like about 3 months to do it. I said, okay, I'll do it. Esther Larson she'd sketch up the garments, then they would do a junior version of the garments. So then I would get the sketches. And they wanted me to work in the same style as Esther Larson, same technique, which I was able to do. So that's why they hired me. And I did that job, and it turned out well. And then I went to Puerto Rico for a month to recuperate.
Perfect.
Yeah, right. But that was one of my first jobs.
Right. So you worked for magazines, you worked for companies, and you worked for department stores.
Right.
Those are the three
Then I moved to the West Side, and I was living off 68th Street in Central Park West. And on that block were some fabulous people. Eli Kazan lived on that street. Ruben Cruz lived on that block. I met a lot of people. Edward Villela lived there, great dancer for the American Ballet. And I met a lot of people. And there was a wonderful woman I met who she wound up modeling for me, because at that point I had gotten a few accounts, Best & Company, Plymouth Shop. And her boyfriend had his own business. It was a sweater business called Carrara. And he also had a friend who did Raphael sportswear. It was expensive. So he said to her, well, your friend Linda, she's a designer. She said, what is she? She says, well, she draws, I know she draws. So he says, I have some ideas, but I can't put it down. I can't. He says, ask her to come over and maybe we can work something out. So I went over, and he's telling me what he wants, and I'm sketching and I'm making suggestions to him about the construction and all that stuff. And we wound up working together for several years. Through him, I met other people, and I got into design, kind of through the back door. And I worked for a company called no, I'm blanking on the company. It was a company like Schrader, Baron Peters, Robert Leonard. It was a very high-end company, but it was for older women. They used very expensive fabrics. Eleanor Simmons, who worked for Schrader many years and years ago, she hired me. And I got into the design end that way. So I had a glimpse of and it was in the good buildings where 350 7th Avenue. So there was a lot of good people in that building. I got to see a lot of clothes. She went to Italy twice a year for the collections. She'd send me back all kinds of things in fabric and stuff. So I had like a lot of hands-on things with that. And so I was kind of starting to phase out of Carrara, even though I would work with my friend's boyfriend somewhat. And I was, but what I liked about that was I got into he was into sweaters.
Is this still the 60s, or is this still the 1960s, or are we moved to
this is 60s, 70s.
Okay.
This is now going into the 70s. And I was working with sweaters with him, and that's how I got interested in hand knitting also, and some machine knitting, brothers machine knitting and that kind of thing. And and Perry Ellis was very hot at the time, doing a lot of sweaters and whatever. And as I told you before in the past, my mother was a phenomenal knitter. My grandmother had passed already at that point. And I said to my mother, I think we should do some sweaters. Let's do some things. And she said, okay. And we did. And we did a lot of the kind of the little crop sweaters, little cable sweaters. They kind of blew out. We couldn't keep any stock. People would, and sweaters are forgiving because size range is not as specific as woven clothing. So,
so did you have your own label? Or
we had like not a label, but we had a business. And I didn't really know anything about being in business because, I was never led into that direction. So we were just doing it. And then I got involved with these people that had Peruvian sources, which is now very big. It's so ironic that today a lot of knitwear and fabrics are coming out of Peru. And I did a collection for them of woven and sweaters, but very box, like this is going now into the 80s, and it was very like just influenced by the Japanese designers, the very boxy, but using the Peruvian textiles and the sweater knits. And that was very good.
Where were you selling your work? Where was the...
it was kind of like word of mouth. And people would get they'd see the sweater, and then they would come, and they would say, oh, well, I would like this in 3 colors, and then this friend would say, I want this, and this, and it just like, there wasn't anything to do. We didn't have to advertise it. But then my mother would, she was too hot. She said to me, I said, Ma, we have a big order. We have to get this out. And she said to me, I don't work after 5 o'clock. I said, what? You have to work after 5 o'clock. We have orders. She says, you got to, no. She says, I don't work after 5 o'clock. It's got to wait. And they waited. They waited. They wanted the sweaters.
This is what led you to work for the union, because you understood intuitively what it was to work with unionized.
Not quite, but meanwhile, I was at FIT. I was working out in industry. I was busy. I was teaching part-time here because they hired me when I was like 26. So I was like a child teacher. I didn't know you had to have a roll book I didn't know you had to manage a classroom. I didn't know that teaching was a profession. So what I did was I was here for a while, and then they told me, come in. We want you to be full-time and whatever. And things started to change in the industry because, as I said, it started to go more digital. The catalogs went away. The newspaper ads disappeared and went into photography. So as this shift started to happen, the design end still was happening, but the illustration end fell away. So I had the time to do it, and I said, let me try it. I'll see if I like it as on a full-time basis. And I did, and voila, here I was.
Do you remember what year that was that you started full-time at the college?
83.
83, okay.
83. And then, and all along, actually, George Levinson, who passed away, he was a VP for the union. He had run into me a number of times, said, why don't you get involved in the union? Why don't you get involved in? I said, I don't have time for that. I said, I'm working. I said, I have a lot of jobs here I have to. So anyway, then one day, Lou Stollar sees me in the elevator. He was my teacher. He was my psychology teacher. So he sees me and he says to me, I think you should work for the union. You should come to the union. I said, I don't know. He says, well, there's going to be a job vacated. He says, maybe you should come up and apply for it. I said, oh, okay. I figured, let me apply for it just to keep him quiet, So I went upstairs and they interviewed me. And they actually interviewed 4 people for that job. It was like, the job doesn't even exist anymore. It was for an assistant secretary. Well, I don't hear from them. I figured, I didn't want the job that much anyway. And then they call me and they say, you have this job. I said, how did I have this job? Well, years later, Juliet told me that I was the 4th choice. That there were other people they wanted, but then when push came to shove, those people said they weren't going to do it. So I started doing that, taking minutes at meetings, which is not my favorite thing. I could do it, but I mean, when you take minutes, you can't participate like everybody else. And then one day I said to Lou, Lou, this is not the way I really want to contribute to the union, because I can't participate the way I would like to, because I'm more of a people person. I don't want to sit there writing. So he said, okay, now we're going to change the way the meetings are run. Everybody's going to take a turn taking minutes, so Linda doesn't have to do it all the time. He was crazy about me. Anything I wanted, it was okay. So I started like that, and I became secretary. Then they needed a grievance officer, the VP of grievance, and he said to me, I think you should be the grievance officer. I said, I don't know anything about labor law or grievances or anything. He says, you know how to talk. He says, you're smart, you can learn. You'll learn it. I know you will. So I did. And I studied, I went to took union courses, I worked with our LRS, Labor Relations Specialist, and I learned how to do it. And at that time, in the college, there was a lot of adversarial things going on. Not mentioning any names, but it was very adversarial.
Well, can you tell us the nature of the conflict? And also, what year was this roughly?
This was in the early, I would say, 2000s.
Oh, okay.
The beginning of 2000s.
Okay.
When I became the grievance person. And the conflict, the nature of the conflicts was that the HR and the union were not seeing eye to eye. And there were a lot of people that were being, whose jobs were hanging by the balance. And I had my grievance boards, I had a big board, grievance board. I had an addendum to that grievance board. That's how many grievances we were filing and keeping up with it. And then it didn't stop with the grievances, you go to arbitration. So it was like, this was like more than a full-time job. This was like a career already. But and they will even tell you that as the grievance officer, I filed more grievances than all the grievance officers in the history of the union.
Wow.
So I had experience with all kinds of cases, which some people just didn't have. And I was doing that, I grew to love it. I really did. I grew to love it because I felt I could help people, and I saved a lot of jobs. And worked at a lot of situations with people over at HR and kind of calmed the waters, and it was good.
Did you miss teaching?
I was still teaching.
Oh, okay.
But not full time, because I would have release time to be the grievance officer.
Okay.
I still taught, and yeah, I still taught. So, because I didn't want to stop teaching. Only the president of the union has full release time.
Got it.
Okay. So then, after that, the president of the union changed. Juliet retired. Roberta was kind of next in line to inherit the throne. And they wanted me to be the executive vice president. And I said, look, I'm getting too old for this already. I think you need a younger person to, bring them along. So they said, no, they can't. Nobody's going to be able to handle it. Nobody has your experience, which was true, because a lot of people had left. And the newbies were like deers in headlights. I mean, this was brand new to them. They were not experienced. She says, I need you to do this. I said, okay, I'll do it. And I figured, I don't know, maybe I'll do it for, 1 term or 2 terms. But it turned out to be longer than that. But I liked it anyway, because I had the grievance experience, plus I had dealt with everybody from President Brown to the guy in the basement that moves the carts around and whatever. I mean, it was just everybody. I met everybody here.
What's it like to run a union at a shop like FAT?
Say again?
What is it like to run a union at a place like FAT?
It's wonderful because FIT's contract is held up as the benchmark of contracts in all the community college schools. Our contract, first contract, was written in 1967. People couldn't get what we have in our contract today. It would be impossible because you couldn't even negotiate it. Nobody would want to negotiate it. And the things that the union negotiated for its members are things, retiree benefits, which are incredible, medical benefits, which are incredible. Nobody has what we have, because I know everybody else's contract.
Now, the original architects were Lou Stollar and Feldman? Is that who they were?
Well, Lou Stollar was, yes, he was the primary architect of the contract. And because of his relationship with Marvin Feldman, who I remember quite well and who did me many favors with my fashion design classes when they used to put on shows, he, because of their friendship and also Marvin's appreciation for its faculty, the faculty, we were able to get a lot of benefits that because he thought the people that worked here were the greatest. I mean, he admired everybody's talent. He himself was an artist of sorts. He used to do these, you know, like Louise Nevelson sculptures. He would do things of that nature, Marvin Feldman. And there were times where we would go to his house. We'd play poker with him. He was very famous for putting a bottle of Johnny Walker Black on the table. Whether you're negotiating or not negotiating, playing cards or not, we played poker. And of course, I was much younger then. I didn't drink then, so I didn't, you know, this was all new to me. But Lou knew how to manage this, and he was very instrumental in creating what we have today.
What was Lou like?
Lou was...
So sorry to interrupt, just have to change the camera battery.
Oh,
I'll
okay.
just hit pause.
Take a pause.
Yeah.
the pause that refreshes.
Exactly. Okay.
Because I'm starting.
Very good. This is great, Linda.
It's like telling tales out of school. I'm trying to keep it as clean as I can. Now that she's...
Just tell us everything.
Tell it like it is, right?
Like it is.
Well, that was one glimpse of it, but you know, he started the idea, Marvin Feldman, of what does he call it? Like the leadership of the faculty.
Feldman started the...
Like a young faculty leadership thing happening. And he would take us on retreats. You would have to be invited to go. I was invited, Nick Politis was invited, Artie Koppelman was invited, Annette Pecora's former husband who passed away, he was in Lou's department. He was invited. A lot of the people that are not here anymore, you know, but who were also help build these departments here and create, you know, a lot of new ideas here. So we used to go on these leadership retreats, so to speak. Yeah, he did that.
Just as an aside, you also have a bachelor's from Queens College. What was that about?
Well, when I was teaching here, Terry Riley, who started a program in the history of costume way back when, and she was going to Queens College for a degree in art history because in order to teach the historical part, people felt you needed either the historical background or a theatrical costume background. So while she was doing that, she said, you know, maybe, I was teaching already here. She says, you know, maybe you should take some courses and go for your degree in art history because you have the qualifications because you either had to be a costume designer with a degree in theatrical costume, or you had to be a designer with a degree in art history. So probably they would have taken historical costume as well, you know. So I went to Queens College, and at that time they had an excellent art history program. The guy who wrote the book on, history book on Berenson, which is the Bible of art history. He taught there. He was my teacher. Another guy who wrote the Baroque Bible, Slatkus, he was my teacher. And there was another guy who did the Egyptian, he was so brilliant, Dr. Shulman, he passed away. He wrote the Bible on Egyptology and Egyptian history. And I used to take his class at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I would bring him a bagel and a cup of coffee. And he'd sit on his desk, and people, and this is early in the morning, people, you know, he was mesmerizing. He wanted me to go to the Art Institute of Chicago because he thought I could become an Egyptologist. So I said to him, get a grip on reality. I said, what the hell? I said, I got a job at FIT. I'm designing on the side. When am I going to do this? And I said, and can I make a living doing that? Because a lot of these people, they just, you know, they have trust funds or whatever. So he said, what are you worried about? You'll just go, you'll see where it will take you, whatever. I said, great. So I said, okay, we'll think about it. But I didn't do it. I didn't pursue it because I really needed to support myself, and I didn't feel I had that luxury, even though I was fascinated by it. I went to Egypt, I went to Israel, we went on all these digs and everything. It was fabulous. But a career, I didn't think it was a career for me. And because a lot of it is very isolated work, and it's not something where you're dealing with people. I got my degree in art history, and then I came here and I started teaching history of clothing past and present and contributing to it. And then from there, they expanded that course to the 21st century. And the program grew, and of course sections grew, multiplied, so that's how that happened.
And you have, in recent years, you've written a book as well about how to present your portfolio.
Right. Well, the book really started with a colleague of mine, this is going back 20 years, saying that there was no book on how to do a portfolio, what the components of a portfolio consisted of. And he said to me, why don't you do the book? So, and at the same time, Stephen wanted to do a book on illustration. So we knew people at Fairchild Publication. So they contacted me and they said, well, we hear that you're the maven on portfolio presentations. So I said, okay. They said, can you write up a few chapters and then we'll send them out and get the feedback from the readers on if it's something they want. And I did, and they sent it back in seconds. We want it, where is it, when is it coming out, we need it, you know, whatever. Because a lot of people that teach fashion drawing or portfolio don't have the background that we have. They're just given that course, and they have to somehow come up with it. And the only way they can come up with it is through a text. So I did the book, and that's how the book began.
All right. So 1963 to 2019, how has FIT changed?
Well, physically, the footprint has changed. FIT was the C building, or the Marvin Feldman building, and they had just built, in my second year, they had just built the co-ed dorm.
Did you stay on campus? Did you live on
No,
campus?
I commuted home. I would stay here till probably 6:30 6:30, 7 o'clock. Then I get on the train, go to Brooklyn, walk home. My mother would put food on the table. I go upstairs. I would do with my illustration homework, get dressed, go back on the train. That's how it was.
And draw more, come back and draw.
Well, every night we drew. Every day we drew. Every night we drew.
Wow.
I mean, day and night. It was day and night. And then I would cry because I would tell my sister, oh, so terrible compared to the other people in the class. Because they all went to specialized high schools. They went to music and art and design. I went to Madison High School in Brooklyn. You know, I had Millie Glaberman, but she didn't really have a background in it. She was just gorgeous, you know. She looked like Audrey Hepburn. I mean, she was just a vision and dressed impeccably, and she was just so stylish. And I just, you know, I loved her. But I didn't learn how to draw with her or anything like that. I didn't get that till I came to FIT. So a lot of the other people, they had backgrounds.
Right.
So I had to catch up quickly.
Seems like you did. You got jobs right out of here.
I used to draw on the subway. Like when I would take the train from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and you know, people would be standing there or whatever, and I would sketch, and then I'd sketch on the way back. And then I would have dinner, and then I'd draw some more upstairs in my attic.
Aside from the footprint, how else do you think the college has changed?
Well, the college is much more structured. And it's also layered with many more administrators. There were people, first of all, when I came in, there was a huge continuing ed area. And it was overflowing. There were so many night classes. It was like they would beg me to teach more than one class, beg me. And there was times I taught 2 classes. I taught summers. I subbed for people. I mean, I was working day and night. But then Dick Moore, his name was. He was the dean. They called it a dean, but I don't know if he was of continuing ed. Richard Moore, and he built an empire in that continuing ed department, and that has dwindled to nothing. I mean, really nothing. Because even people with high seniority can't even get a class. I mean, they don't even run, in some cases, more than 1 or 2 classes now. When I was assistant chair in my department, I used to program the evening classes. I used to program 60 classes in the evening. 60. And in the summer, I had 25, 30 classes. Wow. This is like a new, you know, another thing. And I think that would be tremendous income for the college. Yeah. And I think the college has allowed that to dwindle over time. I think that's a big difference. I think also that there was less faculty, and the people and the chairs have less, I don't want to say control, but less to say, that it's more administrative driven. And there's a lot of layers of approval here. I mean, it goes up and then it goes down, and then it goes up again and it goes down, it goes up, you know, continually. That's another thing that kind of like disenfranchises the faculty, I think, and the, you know, people that, and another thing I think, Years ago, they used to really rely on a lot of people that had expertise in what they did to do things here. Like Takashi in interior design did a lot of building projects for the college, whatever. I did a lot of consultation for, did a lot of design competitions. I mean, a bazillion design competitions. And I love New York and the Mohair Council, and I can't even tell you how many there were. And now everything goes through this very rigorous legal channel. Some of that is good, though, because there should be some controls
Oversight,
on that.
yeah.
But then some of it is just, whatever. So that's basically what it's about.
That makes sense. How about the industry itself?
Well, the industry has shrunk, obviously, because when I began in the 60s, mid-60s, when I began working in 65, I say 65 because I graduated in 64, and that's when I got my first full-time. I was really working in 64, but 95% of the garments were made in this country. And today, 95% of the garments are made outside of this country. And a lot of that, I think, has changed the industry because the manufacturing is not here. And the idea of made in America, union label, and all that is like kind of gone away a little bit. I think now, though, with sustainability and social responsibility, I think they're kind of trying to get that back into here. But there's other things, the political things about in New York now, where the garment center used to be, that's very high-end real estate, and it's very costly for people to start businesses or to run businesses in that kind of environment. So people are moving to going to Hudson Yard and going to the Naval Yard in Brooklyn, and trying to find other places to manufacture. Practically all the fabric industry that used to be in North Carolina is now, the fabric's coming from Europe and Japan and all different other countries. So that piece of the business is no longer here. So, I don't know that they're offering enough incentives for people to be here, and to be able to give back to the country. But I think that's lacking, and that's why the business is the way it is today, because it's really not here. I mean, years ago, you would see people with racks going up and down 7th Avenue. I saw Calvin Klein many times pushing coats up to Bonwitella on 7th Avenue and across town to sell his coats. That's those days are gone.
Yeah. You, speaking of Calvin Klein, you've worked with alumni and taught alumni who went on to have really great careers. Can you tell us about a few of them or favorites?
Well, Victor Alfaro, I loved Victor, and Francisco Costa. Actually, they were not even, they didn't have green cards. I think there was a group of us that wrote letters to get them their green card citizenship or whatever we did at that time. But they were very, very talented, very, very talented students. There was so many. I had more recently a woman, Bhavna, her name is. She's out of India. And she has a couture business in India, and she had did a secondary line, and she came to see me fairly recently, like about within the year. It was like 8 months ago, and always sends me her lookbook and everything. Like, she's got a wonderful, fabulous business in India. I think the beauty of it is, well, Christina Salomon years ago worked for Adrian Vittadini for 1,000 years. Another woman from Korea, Youngja. These were all in my class in '83. That was probably the most talented class I ever had. I consider that my #1 top class. Sue Seipel, she worked for many people, had a wonderful career. Some of those people, Stephen Cutting, teaches in our department. He was in my class. He has a great career with G3 and did a lot of leather manufacture for many companies, including Calvin and a lot of those people. Well, Randy is probably the most visible, I would say.
This is Randy Fenoli.
Randy Fenoli. It was just like a fate how we met. I was teaching with Lita Kandi, who has passed away, and we were teaching design studio. And at that time, they had fashion shows in the lower division. And Kleinfelds came to us and said, we have a contest, we want you people to participate. And no legal, no nothing. They said, here's the contest, no garments to be made or whatever, just sketches. We want sketches and we want fabric boards. So I said to Lita, okay, so what do you want? She says, you handle it, it's all art. It has nothing to do with me. So I said, okay. So meanwhile, it was an upper division contest. Mm-hmm. Randy was a 3rd semester student. He wasn't upper division. So she said, you handle it. I said, okay. So he heard about it because I had told him about it. And I said, let's see do something, I said, it's only one sketch and a board, a fabric board. So he did 6 sketches and 6 fabric boards, and they were beyond the beyond. And the other people also participated, and who was judging the contest was Vivian Diamond, who was the wife of Paul Diamond, who owned the Diamond Collection. And Vivian owns the bridesmaid section, which is Desi. That still exists, but the Diamond Collection is gone. So she's the judge, and I don't tell anybody he's a 3rd semester student, except I did tell Joyce Brown once at his show. I said, Randy wouldn't be where he is if he wasn't in that design competition. Anyway, she looked at me like, anyway. So anyway, he was chosen, and it came with an internship and a job placement. And he worked for them. He won, and there was money also because he won the contest. And his dress was a halter bridal gown, which nobody had ever seen a halter bridal gown before that time. So he was the next Frank Massandrea of the bridal industry. Frank Massandrea was probably the biggest bridal designer. American bridal designer, and then he passed away in the 80s with a lot of the designers like Tracy Mills and all those people. So he got that job. He worked for the Diamond Collection. He did very well, and then it becoming too overwhelming for him. So he moved, went back home to Louisiana and New Orleans, and he took like a sabbatical. But meanwhile, we were always in touch. And he would call me up when he was working for them and say, "Oh, I'm leaving the company, this pattern maker, he's driving me crazy. I can't stand it, I hate it." I said, "Listen to me. You cannot move, don't make me come over there and break every finger on your hand." I said, "Because this guy knows what he's doing, he's seasoned, he's an old guy, and he's gonna retire in a couple of months, and you're gonna know everything that he knows, and you got to stay there and learn." And weekly I would give him these pep talks, and he stayed there. Well, his patterns turned out to be the best in the industry. Wow. Because he stayed there, because I made him stay there. Anyway, so he's in Louisiana, he comes back, calls me up one day, he says, "Guess what, I'm director of Kleinfeld." I said, "What does that mean?" He says to me, "Well, I'm going to help them, like the brides, style them with the dresses and, that, not designing, but styling." So he's doing that. It's very popular and whatever. Everybody's happy with him. He's got a great personality and so forth, Then one day, a bride comes in. She's like 4x4. She has this dress on. And she says to him, she sees him passing in the hall, and she said, "Oh, Randy, can you tell me, what do you think of this? Do you think this is okay?" And he never says anything bad about anybody to anybody. He's so good. So he says, "I have some dresses I'd like you to see before you make a decision on that." So he went into the back room and he pulls out 5 dresses. Meanwhile, the other saleswoman says to him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I sold her this dress. This is a $15,000 dress, and you're ruining my sale." So, long story short, he goes home. He's sure he's going to be fired. He says, I'm probably going to be fired, Comes back in, and the woman, Leslie from Kleinfeld, says to him, she's the owner, "Randy, can I speak with you a second?" He says, "Okay, here it comes." She says, "They want to do a show." He says, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, there was somebody here from the television station, from his station that he's on, not FX, but it's
Bravo.
No, it's not Bravo. I can't think of it this minute, but it's you would know it. And they saw that little interaction you had with that woman, and how you kind of turn that around, and that's what they want to do. They want to do a show based on that. So he was like flabbergasted. I mean, this happened like out of the sky. And he did that show, and then he did Randy to the Rescue, and then he did another show for the Oscars. And he's in town now taping, I don't think, 3 shows, three or 4 shows. He's in 180 countries all over the world. Oh. And that's the Randy Fenoli story.
Wow, that's incredible.
And deserves everything he gets, because he is the kindest, the most talented, never a bad word about anybody, good as gold, and he had a very humble beginning. So he really is a star. He really is.
Are there other, aside from alums, and you've mentioned a number of people that you've worked with, but are there other people at the college who influenced you, or who who you remember or think fondly of? They could be administrators, they could be other teachers.
Yes. Well, apart from Lou Stollar, I would say, who was a role model for me. But there's been such wonderful people. Of course, I think Marvin Feldman was a great influence on me. Because sometimes I would try to do things and I wouldn't succeed necessarily. And he would say to me, you know, if you don't fail, you're not aiming high enough.
Right.
So I, used to relax a little bit about that. I thought he was a great guy. There were so many people along the way, I think, that Gladys Marcus, I think, was phenomenal. She put me together with Nick Politis to write the first international interdisciplinary course.
Wow. Which was, do you remember what it was?
Yeah, it was costume history and interior design from the Baroque to the 20th century. We taught it in Paris.
Wow. That sounds cool.
Paris, Lyon. Yeah, it was great. 7 years. Abraham.
What person do you think had the most positive influence over your life? And what did they do to influence you? Got it.
What person had the most positive influence over my life? Well, it's in different ways, I would say. I would say Millie Glaberman, starting there. My great aunt, who was a painter, there. There's like kind of along the way. I don't think you can say that there was one person. Okay, Lou Stollar for sure. I think my working with the union was a life-changing experience for me, really. Stephen
Stippleman?
Yeah, Stephen had a tremendous effect on me. He was so talented, and he's very, very intuitive.
Yeah. What would you most like for people to remember about you?
I think I'd like people to feel I inspired them in some way.
Good. That's good. And do you have any? Is there a question that you wish I had asked that I didn't ask?
You were pretty good.
Okay. Good. Okay.
I hope I answered them as.
Yeah, you were great.
Hope it was okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I appreciate that you did this. I think it's a wonderful thing you guys are doing, really. I don't know who will look at it someday. Maybe a stone will be uncovered. And
Well, thank you, Linda.
Thanks.
well, thank you.